My name is Genevieve Brisky. I'm professor of sociology and I'm a director of the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia and the Center for European Studies. And I have the immense pleasure and distinct pleasure today to host Fiona Greenland. I will tell you a little bit more about her and her accomplishments in a minute. To the podium. Okay, I'm being filmed too. This is a hybrid event. But to welcome you to our first event of the semester in the cycle called Conversations on Europe. And as I said, it's special to have Fiona because she's a U of M alum. And she's also my doctoral daughter, if I may say. I was her dissertation advisor. And it's really special, actually, it's like goosebumps to have someone that you see already. Fiona, when she came here, she already had a doctorate from Oxford University in archaeology. But she was still trained as a sociologist and started the program like everyone else, even though she was quite special given her previous training. So to see someone, you participate in training, come back as an associate professor because it's now official, right? Rubber stamped. Fiona now is associate professor of sociology at UVA. It's quite something for us, the University of Michigan. And I'm sure it's special for you too, to be back in your old digs and to see old friends and mentors. So now on for the formal introduction. Fiona Greenland is associate professor of sociology at the University of Virginia. She obtained her PhD from the University of Michigan about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, in 2014. Time flies. She studies nationalism, art markets, and the politics of cultural heritage. And her book, Ruling Culture, Art, Police, Tomb Robbers, and the Rise of Cultural Power in Italy, was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2021. She won an award for that book from the American Sociological Association's section on cultural sociology, or the sociology of culture. And generally, Fiona's research has received about every award and grant that you can. And her work has been published in the American Journal of Cultural Sociology, in Nations and Nationalism, Sociological Theory, and Here in Society, among other outlets. She's also the founder and co-director of the Curia Lab, the Cultural Resilience Informatics and Analysis Lab at UVA. And her research has been supported by the NSF and the Institute for the Humanities and Global Culture at the University of Virginia. She held also visiting position at the University of Chicago. And basically, I served on many committees also for the American Sociological Association. So it gives me great pleasure to host you here at the University of Michigan as a visitor now, and to hear about your new book and your expertise. And a few items to note before we clap and welcome you to the podium. This is also a Zoom webinar, so we will have a Q&A session after the formal presentation, and I would ask people who are currently online to write your questions in the chat, and we will have someone informing us and Fiona of the questions so you can participate virtually. So please now join me in welcoming Fiona.
Thank you for the generous introduction. I have an enormous intellectual debt to Genevieve, as well as a personal debt for being the ideal dissertation chair and all-around supporter of new projects. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here, to return. And it is nice to note the error now that this title is already obsolete. In fact, this is my first talk since getting tenure on Friday. Derek just coming up here. Perfect, let's leave it right there. So just want to start with a story that caught my attention earlier this month. Investigators citing looting have seized 27 antiquities from the Met. This is, of course, the Metropolitan Museum of Art with an annual budget of about $250 million and one of the cultural behemoths in the United States, to say nothing of the world. So these sorts of stories seem to be getting pretty commonplace. You need only open your news feed or Twitter to see new restitution claims coming through every day, every week. It can therefore be tempting to gloss some of the details or to try to fix this into a background of undifferentiated momentum towards art restitution. But I want to resist that for just a moment and dig into a couple of details that caught my eye. Two quotations that I pulled out here for us to think about. The norms of collecting have changed significantly in recent decades, the museum said, and the Met's policies and procedures in this regard have been under constant review over the past 20 years. So the big picture story here is that the Manhattan district attorney went into the museum and seized these 24+ objects that had questionable ownership history. We might say, those of us in the business, questionable provenance. Let's go down to the next quotation. This is an outside observer. The Met should have done more to review the origins of the artifacts before being prompted into action by a law enforcement inquiry. So, okay, clearly there's a problem here. The Met, it is suggested, was complacent, while law enforcement took an active approach and uncovered irrefutable evidence of artifact theft. Now I'm going to return to this point about the nature of research and investigation, but for now I just want to make one more point about this story. So this was something of a flashback. 16 years ago, there was another entanglement, a dramatic entanglement between the Italian government and the same museum. And in this case, the Italian government had been pressing their case for almost 40 years. At issue was a group of artifacts, but really the centerpiece was this stunning 5th century BC crater or wine mixing bowl. Now, the Italian authorities had been saying since 1971, when the Met purchased this, that it had been stolen. The Met was not interested in the case, refused to sit down and negotiate, or dismissed the claims out of hand. It took that long for momentum to build, the case to be brought forward, and the Met, in the end, to agree to restitute the vase, which you see being unveiled here in a ceremonial return at the state prosecutor's office in Rome. But let's look at what the former museum director, Philippe de Montebello, said after that. Said after the restitution agreement. February 2006. The world has been atomized into a set of political entities. There is a resurgence of nationalism and misplaced patriotism. There is a sense that this is our identity, but I can't see how a Greek vase is the identity of a modern day Italian. And I want you to look at what the reporter said. So the interviewer, Deborah Solomon. She affirms it exactly. On what basis can Italians in the 21st century say that the Euphrosyne crater, which was created in Greece more than 2,000 years ago, belongs exclusively to the Italians? Now, this repatriation was a hard-fought victory for the Italians, as I have said. It was likened to a David and Goliath story. But I want us to think for a minute about what has changed in the discourse and in the set of beliefs that have led to this month's seizure. Moving on from that point of view. So when I say that this month's seizure was unfathomable 16 years ago, I mean even this piece of the story, that you have now the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, so this is from their Twitter feed, standing alongside the Italians, and they played a major role in carrying out this seizure at the Met. We could not be more proud to stand beside our partners at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office and our partners in the Italian government as we return these priceless antiquities to their rightful owners, the people of Italy. Rightful owners, people of Italy. So my main question today is, how did this happen? Why is Italy now a dominant force in art restitution? And I'm going to argue, drawing out of the evidence in my book, that Italy has leveraged the ambiguities inherent in international art restitution and reshaped the practice and logic to align with source countries' interests. So this term source country is often used to refer to the countries from which an artwork or artifact is taken. And many folks use the term destination country or market country for the places where they eventually arrive or are collected. So the key practice that I'm going to talk about is provenance, and the key logic is distributed sovereignty. So first I want to tell you a little bit about what went into this book. So this is a historical study that starts in and around the time of Italian unification in the 1860s, and then worked through the early 21st century through archives and extensive field work. So in the field work part, I did interviews and observations in Italy with a small group of tomb robbers in 2 different communities, art squad employees, archaeologists, some of whom worked for the state service, so they're public sector archaeologists, but others who were doing university work, and some of them were Italian, but many not. And then local residents. So I was also very interested in what local people had to say about this ecosystem of looting national heritage and practices of protection, and especially in their relationship with the art squad employees or the law enforcement agents who were doing frontline national heritage work. And then in the archival piece, a lot of work in national archives, Ministry of Culture reports, newspapers, and then in the international setting, UNESCO committee meetings, and then restitution petitions and court cases. There's no single archival source here because so much of this work and so much of this effort is scattered across different agencies. And that's one of the things I'll be talking about today as one of the reasons for this shift or the growing momentum in global restitution cases. So here's the content of today's talk. I also want to mention that I had COVID 6 weeks ago, and I'm still sometimes coughing. So if that happens, I want you to know that I'm negative and that I might not read every word on the screen. So I know you can read. Right, so the first part of this talk, I want to define the problem space, this concept of the world's greatest cultural power, a big claim made by Italy and what that means. Second, repatriation itself, talk about the global infrastructure and context. And then towards the end, 2 cases in which Italy restituted back and why that's significant for its dominant position today. And if along the way you have any questions, want me to clarify anything, I'm very happy to be interrupted. Okay, so as Genevieve mentioned, I was an archaeologist for about a decade before converting to sociology. And in my years at excavation sites in Spain and Italy, I had heard and seen a lot of interesting things. So one day while I was reading materials for my dissertation, I came across this passage. So this is an interview from the Secolo d'Italia with a high-ranking Carabinieri Art Squad member. He said, we have 60% of the world's artistic and historic patrimony. Our artworks are admired by everyone. The antiquities trade pays top money for any Italian piece. We have the best professionals fighting that trade. Italy is the world's greatest cultural power. So that percentage claim is interesting. And in fact, that comes up a lot. This is a kind of recurring rhetorical device. I've seen the claim of 80%. I've heard Tuscans say that 90% of Italy's cultural patrimony is in Tuscany itself. 75%, we want to think about this more as a signifier than as an empirically grounded number, but it's a number with key symbolic value. So for him, for Musella, in this context, it's 60% of the world's artistic and historic patrimony. Italy is the world's greatest cultural power. This is how the interview proceeded. I want you to think about that as a series of claims leading up to the bold text there. So this absolutely stopped me in my tracks. Dissertation researcher looking for empirically grounded claims or just some kind of evidence for how this whole structure works, this system of cultural power. I also thought it was a fairly audacious claim. Like, what does it imply about the rest of us or the rest of the world? But once I regained my composure and thought about it further, I realized that Musella's statement actually offers a provocative insight into the relationship between cultural heritage and state power in modern Italy. So, what is cultural power? I invite you just for a minute to erase everything you've already associated with this term so that we can try to build up a definition together. So one way we might think about defining cultural power is to look at external ascriptive devices, or the formal recognitions, classifications, and quantification exercises that affix value to culture. The UNESCO World Heritage Site list is a classic example of how to do this. Italy has been at the top of this list for as long as I've been doing this work. It was tied with China, I think, for a year in 2019, before going back up to the #1 spot. I always find it interesting how when I show this list in talks, I can see who in the room works on each country for how they're kind of like sizing up where their main research country fits within this list. And in case you're wondering, the United States has fallen out of the top 10 and is now 11 or 12. So this can be one way of registering influence, this external ascriptive device. But there's also a sizable body of research that indicates something of the cultural capital and social capital that goes into generating a list of 58 sites. So we know, for example, that Italy has played a key role in organizing the logic of what goes into a World Heritage site, and that they've actually benefited from this influence in getting more of their own sites registered. By all means, other countries have been participants in this too. I just want to make the point here that this can only be one way of understanding cultural power, given the many interconnections and intersecting interests that go into generating the bureaucracy that puts it together. And one of my favorite works here, I just want to highlight incredible scholarship all around. Victoria Reyes, a young sociologist, did a study of the World Heritage Site didactic boards and materials all across the globe and found that Italy is the most referred to country, even in sites that had nothing to do with Italian or Roman or Etruscan culture. I mean, so in very, very discrepant parts of the world where we don't have traces of direct Italian influence, it's still kind of the air that we breathe, part of the atmosphere for understanding cultural supremacy. Okay, let me go to the next way that we might define cultural power. We might think about government spending. So spending power is often associated with the material resources that a country can bring to bear on propping up its culture and distributing it. I really want to show here, we have annual EU expenditures on culture. And this chart presents 2020 national level expenditures. Hungary and Iceland are a little strange in what they count. We can talk about that later, but I really just want you to focus on where Italy is, slightly below the average. So that's really interesting. They have 60% of the world's cultural heritage, right, or cultural treasures, but the spending here isn't commensurate with what we might expect for that kind of accumulation of goods. So maybe the money for all that national heritage is coming from outside government expenditures, or maybe percentages are not as important as absolute value, right, per capita. But here I just want to make the point that cultural power can't be about spending alone, because we don't see that claim here of 60% or a reflection of its external ascriptive status. So then a third way, a dominant way, and a helpful way in some respects is to think about hard power and soft power. And here we can pick up with Joseph Nye's influential model and think about the ways in which culture can stand for a broad category of activities, novels, paintings, traveling ballet companies, piano competitions that are seemingly apolitical, and a way of extending a nation state's influence into other spheres of practice and politics without seeming to do it in aggressive, hard power kinds of ways. So, as I say, this has useful applications to the Italian case of cultural power, but I think that it alone is also insufficient to capture what Musella meant. So what Musella meant was something different. What he meant was that Italy doesn't just possess or exercise cultural power. He was referring to something much more intrinsic, baked into the system. Because the way he said it in Italian is that Italy is a cultural power. Cultural power in Italy is the logic through which the nation state is structured. It's the ability to govern in particular ways because of accumulated cultural assets. So I think about this in the following theoretical framework. These areas are linked, so these boxes don't signify rigid separation. So we have two things going on here. We have a practice or set of practices leading to provenance, that term I used earlier to refer to the background of an object. And then on the other side, the logic. We can think roughly about nationalism and the mythology of national identity, and then the more rigid legal and economic structures whereby a state claims for itself its cultural property. So what I really want to draw your attention to is, I'm going to be concentrating today over on this side, is that Italy is really interesting for its claim of sovereignty over everything in the soil, so the things we haven't yet excavated, but that can potentially be brought out of the ground and made meaningful, that it is presumed state property. And this is not how every country in the world operates. It's not how we operate here in the United States. So there's something unique, and it's worth thinking about this and its effect for the structuring of cultural power. And today I'm going to give you a couple of highlights from the work that I did in this space and the ways in which heritage is brought out through unofficial practices, tomb robbing, of extracting antiquities. And then on the logic side, I have more to say about this in the book. I'm going to go light on this today, but just to remind ourselves that Italy has a central ministry of culture This is something, another aspect in which it differs from the United States. We don't have a Ministry of Culture or a Department of Culture here. This is significant for the ways in which it coordinates activities, including art historical, archaeological, and law enforcement when it comes to the Carabinieri Art Squad. So I want you to hold that in mind as what's going on, kind of anchoring the state's activities to assert ownership over cultural property, whilst these less official but highly symbolically important activities are going on to generate meanings of heritage and ultimately of provenance. And I'm going to come back to provenance in just a minute. So I want now to shift back to that opening story about repatriation. Are the lights okay? You can see sufficiently the counters on the screen. Great, thank you. So operating across international boundaries, we have three primary tools that can lead to a repatriation claim: customs, memoranda of understandings, and national laws. Why am I telling you this? I'm a sociologist, not a scholar of international law. It's important because there is no single pathway for claiming back art, for seeking restitution, whether it's the British Museum, the Met, or the Natural History Museum here. There's no single one right way to do it. So this is not like getting a driver's license from the Secretary of State. Also, it is important to note that across all three of these, the thread of continuity, is that formal restitution is a nation state issue. So if we go back to Nazi looted art and post-war restitution, the 1954 Hague Convention, and then moving forward to international instruments like the UNESCO 1970 agreement, these were structured in such a way that national governments bring claims to other national governments. And there might be mediating bodies, agencies, there often are, ideally. But what it doesn't leave space for is subnational groups, for example, indigenous communities or tribes, individual claimants, Jewish survivors of the war, for example, found themselves with no single clear pathway to claim back art from the West German government. And then crucially, today, it means that when the nation state process breaks down, there isn't a clear alternative. And this is where Italy's innovation in this arena has been really crucial. These were slightly out of order. So I want to just draw your attention to one of the first attempts to systematize the international system of art restitution. So UNIDROIT is the independent intergovernmental organization, the International Institute for the Unification of Private Law, as it's formerly known. And UNIDROIT has had as its mission since 1926 to unify international law, to create legal harmony across all member states. So at the invitation of the Italian government in 1995, the convention met to discuss looted art and antiquities, and also to come up with a system for restituting things back. So Chapter 3, Article 5 deals with all of the details necessary here to do it. So rather than read all of this text to you, I just want to highlight that the contracting state needs to come forward to the court or other competent authority, and that all of this is embedded in state-to-state harmonization, or the maybe presumed willingness of two states to work together. But what it doesn't really tell us is how a state can move forward with the claim when the other state says no. So UNESCO has its own approach to try to harmonize this work. It's called the Intergovernmental Committee for Promoting the Return of Cultural Property. And here again is UNESCO's attempt. So we have UNIDROIT trying to draw together a single international art restitution system, and this is UNESCO's attempt. And here again, we have member states coming forward to this body to request something from another member state. I wonder if any of you can guess what the longest running case has been for this group. They were founded in 1980. There's one case that they've been hearing every year since they were founded. Yeah, the Parthenon marbles. So every year, Greece asks for its file to be read again, its petitioning claim. And just about every year, this committee meets and says, we agree it would be a great idea for the United Kingdom, for the government to sit down with the Greek government and to try to hammer out an agreement. And that still hasn't happened. I last checked their notes for May 2022, and once again, they dutifully recommended that the United Kingdom and the Greek government sit down together. And that's one of the problems here, is that they can't actually enforce anything. There's no enforcement mechanism. This is a body that makes recommendations, and it can ask the United Kingdom to sit down with Greece, but it has no mechanism for doing anything but doing that symbolic encouragement. So it doesn't have funds that it can divert, or any sort of legal prosecution arm. This is all about advising. And again, requests are made by states to states. I'm hammering home that point of state to state because this is absolutely germane to what's happening right now out there with post-colonial and indigenous claims to come back, because for many years, they hit the wall in trying to reclaim things when their national governments were not interested in taking up the case. So I'm really just trying to get us to understand the mechanics of this, that one would need to get one's national government interested, involved, and willing to take it up to the United Nations in order to advance the claim. And it's worth noting that since 1980, this UNESCO body has resolved 6 cases. So, finding the international system of repatriation slow or unresponsive, claimants have switched to forms of direct advocacy. And here is where, as a sociologist, I get very excited about these alternative mechanisms for building coalitions and for seeking redress. So outside this formal international system, they are no longer relying on UNESCO, UNIDROIT, or the EU, and are instead working with local or national law enforcement, museums, and the press. And what explains this, I argue, is increased awareness of post-colonial reparations efforts, increased law enforcement cooperation, and new strategies of provenance. And the Italian Ministry of Culture and Art Squad have been absolutely central in advancing these. Okay, so I'm about to come up to what will be the most important slide of the deck. So let me just pause a minute. Because of the, we could think of the international system as more of an archipelago. Because of the archipelago-like structure of international art restitution, you have lots of unconnected islands in a chain, and they're all kind of doing similar things, but they're not actually directly working with each other. This has implications for how we study this because there is no single data repository. So with funding from the National Science Foundation and with access to the Artemis database, and it must be said with 2 extremely hardworking student research assistants, I have been working with a body of 165 international cases that encompass 30,000 artifacts. And what I want to draw your attention to is that these different restitution cases are kind of argued on the basis of different historical and cultural contexts. So you're going to see in a minute that there are 4 major contexts out of which cases have been argued: post-colonial, pre-1970, and post-1970. So this is a really influential international convention governing the movement of cultural goods across international lines. And then Nazi looted art. So if you're a lawyer or you're specialist in international law, I want to make clear that this is not about specific legal mechanisms being brought in. It sometimes is, but that's not how I've coded the data. Instead, I'm thinking about the arguments that have been advanced to try to restitute art, working through these alternative pathways through the international system. So let's look now at how these socio-political contexts have been advanced in different decades. Again, using the same database of about 165 cases, we can see from 1980 to 2019 how these different contexts are being invoked at different times. I am most interested in the blue, which is post-colonial arguments, and how that has grown over time. So you can see from 1980 to 1990, we actually have a single case in this database that is argued with an explicit argument about colonial occupation and the rightness of restitution on the basis of colonial redress. You can see that this advances in size to the point where in the 2010s to 2019, which is when the data ends, this is now the largest case, or this is the most representative. Most of the cases now being heard are rooted in post-colonial arguments. This is also significant. So let's look at the orange bar for a minute, Nazi looted art. So there was a kind of surge in cases to do with Nazi looted art in the late 90s and then 2000s. This has to do with some watershed legal decisions in the US courts and also access to archives. So that has remained pretty steady, although coming down in the 2010s. And if I were to show you data from 2020, 2021, and 2022, you'd see similar patterns of increased activity in post-colonial claims. So there's a lot more to be said about the data and different trends, but I really want to draw your eye to the to the increase in the number of cases coming out of post-colonial contexts and arguments, because that has direct bearing on this other argument I've been making about provenance. So this term provenance comes up a lot in archaeology and art history. It's a contested term, I think a friendly contestation, but because it can mean quite different things. And I've just drawn out two of the most influential definitions. It can be the precise location where an artifact was recovered archaeologically, its place of origin in relation to a set of coordinates. And I know we have at least one archaeologist in the room who can speak more about that centrality of find spot or where it's found in the ground. But then also provenance is often used by art historians to refer to the history of where an artifact has been since its creation. So here we would be thinking about the chain of creation, its custody, or its use. So you might see that there's a lot of space for interpretation and negotiation between these things. And in fact, if we take a step back and look at this, there is no hard and fast rule in these blue cases for what provenance means. So this is important because it is exactly in this space that Italy has been most innovative in rethinking or restructuring what provenance is. So I just want to say that one more time. In this international system of art restitution, there's no single definition for provenance. It's open to interpretation. And in fact, when we look at the texts and the arguments being made now in and around restitution, it's shifted much more from one towards two. So the claims now or arguments for why a piece should be returned are likely to say more about where it's been since its creation, its use, the circumstances of its removal, and less about precise find spot or receipts. So we have two boxes of text here, I have given you an excerpt from one of the most recent meetings of the United Nations in discussing an art restitution case. And here they are now shifting from that precise definition of provenance, that is to say that the claimant has to be able to document when and where it was taken, and towards, we could say, a more culturally, socioculturally encompassing definition. The general understanding that existence or non-existence of legislation at the time of removal of cultural property must not be the only issue in considering the return. So Italy has played a major role in achieving this general understanding. It's been working steadily in the background, influential in a number of these cases in international bodies, such that provenance is now the origin as well as the critical history of creating and exchanging artifacts. So I want to turn now back to this to say that provenance here we can understand as the outcome of this process of telling more critical stories of removal, use, and exchange. And that is the part that I've been fleshing out through field work with illegal excavators. So here's one, and this is kind of a celebrity, he's my representative from this class of characters in Italy, Omero Bordo, who died a few years ago. Did prison time in the 1970s, became a variety show star in the 1980s, and then set up his own workshop where he reproduced Etruscan ceramics and actually built Etruscopolis, which is kind of like a reconstruction of an entire necropolis, subterranean necropolis in Italy. So Bordo was something of a laughingstock. He had pretensions to high intellectualism in archaeology and Etruscology. But he was also very influential and looked up to by many tomb robbers in the region. I also want to say, caused a lot of destruction to archaeological sites. So I want to make clear too that, this is very detrimental to trying to reconstruct histories when folks dig deep and fast to get to the best stuff submerged. Careful excavation should be reporting the stratigraphic levels and all archaeological materials, not just the kinds of pots that you hope to sell in the market. So I had the good fortune to meet Michele, who described himself as a reformed tomb robber who grew up in central Italy. And I want to show you a quotation from him, and then the next slide, which will be the last in this section before I conclude, just to give you some ideas about the kinds of things they told me about why they do it, why they're motivated to dig. So Michele said that he had a lot to say about the physical feelings of it, like I was high or something, physically intense. It was a masculine pursuit that he likened to hunting. He excavated, or he dug tombs with his dad and with a couple of men from the community. So this was a tight-knit family endeavor. And that's something that I found a lot in my field work, that people had strong associations with the family, the same sites often used by the same family from generation to generation. So very close ties, trusting ties, and also this is really crucial, digging within one's community. So not moving to other parts of the country, keeping things for themselves or for tightly structured networks of exchange. So Elisa was not herself a tomb robber, but her dad was, and she had beautiful things in her apartment in Rome. And I asked her about how much people knew about that and whether this was shameful or was he scared of the police. I mean, this is a country that prides itself on strict enforcement of its anti-looting laws. But here's what she said. Honestly, nobody cared. Everybody knew each other in the village. Tomb robbing is fairly common. You can't hide secrets anyway. people knew. She said, nobody cares about Nona's little pots enough to call the Kettiniani. These are like inconsequential artifacts, but also they're part of households. I guess if somebody actually showed up with an earth mover and bulldozed the tomb and sold enough stuff to get rich, then the police might get a call. So you notice too that there's a key symbolic shift here for her. She's demarcating the people who sell for profit from the people who dig for their own personal collections, or again, these tightly structured networks of exchange within the community. All of this goes into provenance, local systems of cultural identity born out through provenance, or the stories, this rich set of facts about local histories, digging together, experiencing the earth, and then assembling these little family collections. Jean-Pierre, I think I'm nearly at time, is that right? So I think the best thing for me to do will be to tell you that Italy has restituted things back to its African colonies, and in these cases, it too is building up provenance, but also extending its power through economic treaties and through extended projects of infrastructure that keep Italian influence alive in the country, in this case, Ethiopia. So I think as a sociologist, there are some strong reasons why we all ought to be doing more to study restitution and repatriation. Global social justice efforts, the production of subnational identities through materiality, material experiences and objects, a key form of post-colonial redress that needs to be separated out from the other forms of redress, including monetary restitution. So materiality and objecthood, and then new diplomatic configurations, because finding this international system to be unresponsive to many of these claims, direct advocacy has opened up new pathways and forced new configurations of association. So I've talked only about Italy today, but we could go through the last year of seismic activity really throughout the EU, in the museum sector, throughout African former colonies, asserting claims through these new ways of direct advocacy, all using provenance as a tool that has been developed steadily by the Italian system of cultural power for the last 40 years. So I'm going to leave it there and leave you with this slide. And thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Fiona. And we have time for Q&A from the room and also from virtual friends. So do you want me to take a cue, or you can manage the room yourself?
I'll manage the room, but I can't see the.
Yes, so what I'll do is you take a question here and then. Okay, there is none so far, so.
Start the room. Thank you.
I was wondering if you'd be willing to comment a little bit on when the relationship isn't on a state-to-state basis, but you're dealing with maybe an ethnic group that doesn't have the same level of national recognition.
Yeah, so that accounts for many of the cases that we're seeing open up right now. So historically, the claimant would be relatively disadvantaged in those situations without having sufficient resources to say hire their own lawyers, drum up publicity. I think with a lot of scholars of social movements, it's very interesting how direct advocacy through street protests and social media is now shaping these things. I think we shouldn't overlook the significance of shame, and that museums don't want to be on the wrong side of history. So I think that that's been very productive for opening up these discussions. And also, there's been another shift here, and I think that your question points to it. For a long time, the burden of proof was on the claimant. So along with this change in provenance, as I've been discussing as this discursive form of critical, deep historicizing, the burden of proof is more and more on the institutions. So museums are having to come up with the receipts. And if you think back to slide 2 in that story from the Times, that's what the critics are getting at, and that should have done its homework. It should have been doing much more research all along.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
Regarding these sort of politics of apology, politics of shame, where do you see, how can we make museums more responsible moving forward? Where do you see gaping holes in acquisition practices, or how do we fix this? How do we prevent this from recurring over time?
Stewardship has to be top of the list. So, but stewardship can mean a few different things, but actually Native American communities have done some of the most to advocate for and change models of disputed artifact ownership. So stewardship can include shared legal title over objects, traveling exhibitions, or it can include the material transfer of an object back, but then like a long-term obligation for conservation and care. You know, the possibilities are endless there, but I think that many museums right now are afraid to surface objects that are unprovenanced or undocumented because they're worried about being called out. And like there are serious consequences that go beyond Twitter shaming, right? You could have like disinvestment, corporate bodies pulling out, or philanthropy. Institutions are very sensitive to these discussions right now. They need more models to be able to work with to do the work.
Oh, all right. Thank you, Fiona, so much. This is really fascinating. Also, thank you for the book. Two questions. The first is about, in the book, you talk much more, obviously you couldn't include everything in the book, but about the art squad and the way that the art squad is presented as this kind of template for international efforts. And as you were talking today, I was just wondering about, I can't remember the exact name, but there's another, there's a variety of these special squads in Italy that are sort of the pride of Italy. I was thinking about the one that busts illegal olive oil, and and I wondered how you think about a squad like that in relation to the art squad, if it's also about provenance or if it's a different understanding of authenticity. So that was the first question. And the second question, or just point, is in terms of, I know you didn't have time to really talk about the post-colonial restitutions, but I do think for Italy, provenance is different when they're the one who is being asked to return something, because of course, in both of those instances, those are incredibly contested. And with the obelisk of Axum, I mean, that dragged on for years and years with a lot of foot dragging and the repetition of these kind of Elgin Marble arguments that the Ethiopians couldn't properly take care of it. And then of course the obelisk got struck by lightning and damaged before it left Italy. But I just wonder what you think about when the shoe's on the other foot, how Italy understands provenance or response. And also, I mean, the Museo dell'Africa Italiana, all those debates about what to do and how to display those artifacts, which go back to the fascist era. So, but thank you so much for your talk.
Thanks, Pam. So Pam's asked a question about the art squad. So it's known colloquially as the art squad, and the men I interviewed who worked there referred to their employer as the art squad in English. It's the Tutela del Carabinieri Patrimonio, and it is a special military police unit that sits within the Carabinieri. One of the noteworthy features of this art squad is that every one of its members is trained in specialist art historical or archaeological or manuscript and archival courses. So they have to take the special master's class at the University in Rome. What is significant about this is that they know these objects. They themselves are constructing provenance and doing art historical work as they enforce anti-looting laws. There is some shared jurisdiction, and there are also law enforcement agencies like customs that is both intercepting things at the border and cracking down on fakes, including, let's say, dodgy olive oil. So what I observed in my field work was mostly cooperation. There is some interagency rivalry. I think that happens in a lot of complex modern nation states and bureaucracies. But the key was that they told me independently that they really saw a unified set of activities to protect cultural heritage. So I think that this is a very important logic that kind of permeates throughout the space here. And also we might step back for a minute and ask, like, why is it there's this specialist uniformed agency? They were the first in the world to be created in 1969, and other art or law enforcement units to do with culture, like the one you described, come after that. So it's really influential in that sense, and became actively exported to other countries. So many countries around the world now operate art squad units because they were trained by Italian Carabinieri to do so. So when we're also talking about this increase in the blue column of post-colonial cases and the style of arguments that they're making, I want you to bear in mind that some of these cases are coming out of places where art squad agents did the training for their own field officers. So we're having this kind of like distributed sovereignty that is now working its way into other countries' own mechanisms for building up and protecting cultural heritage. So the second part of your question is harder, and that is just to say quickly, I think you're onto something important, that there are also inconsistencies in Italy's operatings of its own restituted objects. And here I want to emphasize that it has not been, we could say, a good faith actor in some of these cases. That Axum obelisk took nearly 70 years to go back. I mean, it was like years of foot dragging. I think there was like an injection of enthusiasm for correcting that only in the last 20, 25 years. It became a symbol of fascism and was sort of like deeply tied into the iconography of mid 20th century Italy. But what I think in the observations I've made of how the system is working is that there are more individuals working in the relevant government agencies who feel personally committed to this. So then it's a question of how much they can leverage their own authority or resources within their respective government agencies to try to restitute. Yeah. Thank you. So is there a question?
Well, yeah, so there's a Zoom question by Mugi Grecek, who's actually similar to the one Pam asked, but wanted you to discuss what about regarding provenance when the whole society and their archaeological ruins do not belong to the same culture, for instance, between Turkey and its Greek and Roman architectural heritage, or the US and its Native American heritage. So I think you answered Muge's question, so I will pose mine. So I think it's really interesting what you're doing about state power, cultural state power. And in the first part of the talk, you're really talking about state power of Italy on the world scene and how it is trying to establish its place as the premier, cultural power, world power. But then in the second part, then you start talking about the state power as it is exercised within Italy. And you didn't talk about this as much, but I was wondering if you could talk to us about how you see these two forms of state power as kind of intersecting, or how Italy's attempt to establish itself, as a world cultural power is fed by or is feeding its own local policies. Basically, what's the interaction between these kind of two levels of cultural state power?
Thanks for that. They're mutually informative of each other. So when I went into Italy to first do field work for this, I had a certain set of expectations. And one expectation was that frontline enforcement of anti-looting laws would be strict and it would be consistent. And I had a number of reasons for having that expectation, not only how the government described its work, but a body of research, of literature that suggested that. So that wasn't what I found. I found selective enforcement. And I found a particular style of selective enforcement with the field officers from the art squad developing relationships with, we could say, the local ecology of residents, of looters, sometimes of tourists and of other law enforcement professionals, And they were most likely to arrest and enforce against outsiders, so people who were not from the area, who were digging illicitly, but also people who were known to be selling. So that was a major infraction. So that was a case where I did see consistent enforcement. The reason this is significant, thinking about the relationship between, let's say, the micro and the macro, is that selective enforcement was, I realized, because there were some benefits to allowing unprofessional extraction of antiquities to continue. So for people like Michele, who were part of the area, it was about a deep sub-national, almost a pre-Italian alliance with the community. His identity was first in his village and second Italian. And sometimes the field officers were from that area, but not always. So I want to make that clear too. It's not like they're always assigned back to their to the main city or region of their birth. In fact, there are no clear patterns there. So I watched out for that too. It's cultural homophily. Are they like not enforcing the local looters because they know them? That wasn't the case. What I came to theorize throughout this book is that there was a kind of mutual productivity, like there were some aligned interests in letting the fairly harmless, like domestic collecting that, populates Nona's house with pots, and the overall state project of this deep and rich and critical history of the production of provenance. So that is the bigger argument that I make in my book about how and why the selective enforcement is so important. Thank you. There's a hand in the back.
Sort of 3 points. The first is just kind of an observation that in some of Europe, like in Luxembourg and also in England in recent years, you read about farmers who discovered Roman mosaics and immediately given them over to the state. So that kind of is a different image of how then these tomb robbers, it's one of kind of a working together with people with a national patrimony. How does that exist in Italy as well? Or is there something about, is there something specific to the kind of tomb robber profession in Italy that took on an autonomy of its own, whereas a farmer in Luxembourg who discovers a Roman mosaic in his backyard immediately thinks I'm giving it to the Luxembourg state, as I think happened 2 years ago. The second is European powers lost their colonial empires after World War II. Some of them a little bit later, but Italy pretty quickly. And the great sociologist Raymond Aron wrote already in 1940s that France is going to lose its capacity to be a great power. He saw that already, and therefore needs to become a great country of cultural patrimony. And indeed, France has done it in a different way than Italy. So this colonialism topic fits in a weird way with becoming a great cultural projector of power, because they were actually losing that colonial empires. And I wondered whether Italy, I'm getting Italy wrong, I mean, I'm more about the French case. And then the third is on the debate, like, what would you do, Fiona, if you were in charge of the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, where the, one argument is in the late colonial period, all these objects were some of them were seized through conquest, but many of them were sold in the booming tourism trade at the time. And the arguments are often, well, they were sold, there's a receipt for this thing. In the case of the Luff boat at the Berlin Museum from the island of Luff in Papua New Guinea, the people of Papua New Guinea or of Luff said they don't even want it because it's better preserved in Berlin, and they want their children to come to Berlin to see it. So there are all kinds of contesting debates. Absolutely. And I mean, I'm not requiring you to have a position on this, but it seems like you opened yourself up to that by talking about provenance and how it's not just a legal issue. So how would you determine it if you were, say, advising, I don't know, the Humboldt Museum and Forum in Berlin, or some anthropological museum somewhere in Europe that has all kinds of stuff that was purchased en masse in the 1890s, before 1914, usually, sometimes even later.
So I'll take your questions in order. First, regarding the hypothetical situation of finding a mosaic, it sounds like a real situation of the farmer in the mosaic. Yep, Italian law is very clear. In that situation, it belongs to the country as part of the national patrimony. Here's where we get into some interesting questions about incentives or how the law operates. In some countries, there can be a payment for bringing a valuable cultural find to the attention of the authorities. In Italy, the government, if you find, let's say, a mosaic floor embedded in the garden behind your house, it is by right the states, and they can come in and excavate your back garden to document it properly and remove it. My argument, though, about the tomb robbers is different. Some of them did turn things over to the authorities, special things that they found, things they were excited about, or things that they knew would be discovered anyway. And so why not preemptively make that report? But the tomb robbers I studied were finding, according to them, and I have reason to believe them, fairly small scale things, maybe interchangeable coins or pottery or fragments. So they're not reporting it to the state so that they could keep it. I think on the question of colonialism, I believe you were asking about the loss of colonial influence after the Second World War.
It's the loss of colonial empires, great power status, you know, France losing its power as a great
Right.
power status.
Right.
It wasn't ever really a great power, but it was, you know, kind of middling great.
Yeah.
With-
Also, in a way, great power. You know, I think
Yeah, of course.
yeah. So I mean, Georgia, there are a few things involved in like that discussion. One is to say that post-war Italy, firstly, had to rebuild itself, had to wrestle with the very real trauma of occupation, fascist violence, and then economic and political rebuilding. And as you know, like the birth pangs of post-war democracy were also punctuated by foreign investment in political parties, domestic violence, also involving Communist Party, and there's a long and complicated geopolitical story there too, right? I don't know, like, was colonialism and post-colonialism like forefront? I know that in terms of maybe like loss of power, loss of influence, Italy was thinking about its position. It became very involved in UNESCO projects, Aswan Dam being one of them, trying to be more of a cultural diplomat. The 1960s saw a wave of industrial looting of excavation sites. And there's a kind of like separate discussion that one can have about that. But you know, one of the outcomes was Italy saying, we're actually going to get a hold of this international trade. And I really want to emphasize that, like this renewed attention to the predations of foreign collectors. And so that became an operating theme or logic in how the Ministry of Culture reset itself in the 1960s and 1970s. So 1969 opened up its art squad agency with just one officer at first, and then it expanded that. It was influential in the international framework. I can't tell you really, I think, about perceived loss of or we could say like the loss of colonial influence. But I just want to emphasize that there was a lot of work that was being done in the immediate sphere to rebuild a respectable nationalism and a national cultural heritage that could be drawn away from fascism, which had done so much to swallow up the material fabric of antiquity and ancient Rome, and kind of like rebranded itself, right, as Mussolini's almost like private repository of symbols. So that was a lot of work of extricating that materiality from the fascist mythology and iconography. Humboldt Forum, yep, that's back over to you. What do we do?
No, I mean, in general, though, you know, if you have stuff
Sure.
colonialism that was from late 19th to mid 20th century, it was usually, or at least a lot of it was purchased. Right. So this contextual argument is a little different when it wasn't like with the Medellin bronzes taken from conquest.
I mean, they're all
Or is it?
right.
I mean, I'm asking, you know,
They're all complex. Look, like what I personally believe doesn't really matter as a scholar, as an analyst. I'm very, I think, sympathetic to arguments about restitution because I understand the intrinsic importance of materiality objects, archaeology to the construction of identities. And then I see it having real potential in addressing trauma, right? In the kind of like collective sociological sense of that. But you also said something really important, and I feel like as a group, as a room, as a collectivity, we need to think about this too, that there can be very discrepant claims about the same set of objects from the same community. So there is no singular, let's say, indigenous perspective on what to do with human remains in the Smithsonian. And that's been roiling the United States framework of restitution since 1994. So there's no single view in Papua New Guinea as well. Like, to take your example, I think discourse, I think continued conversation, resources for stewardship models, and it's going to be case by case and probably really slow for a long time. That's what I would say to that.
Now, first of all, I want to congratulate you. 1 week, you've been named the tenured professor and a powerful hurricane.
Thank you very much. I've been waiting for that for even longer.
I have such mixed emotions about this restitution thing, because, well, for example, the Cambodian sculptures in the map, I'm sure all of them. And that's terrible, and the Benin proxies and the other marbles all included. On the other hand, there's something to be said for a culture being able to display its wares, or have its wares displayed and its cultural heritage displayed around the world in different places. We don't have to go, as I did, to Cambodia to see the stuff in situ. But I'm not going to go to Benin. There has to be an optimal balance between restitution of cultural heritage and sharing of cultural heritage. In my view, but what's your view?
I want to answer this. There's an issue of cost, right? And cost sharing, basically, because a lot of the places where these artifacts were looted, from colonies did not and do not have the resources to protect those. I mean, that goes back to, what you said, George, about some of the colonies don't want them back because they feel they're better protected in the former empires. So is there then like, responsibility for former colonial empires to say, okay, you don't have the resources, material or human, or, financial to basically take those back? Should we build and train, conservators and build museums, etc., where you can have those back in your countries, although some of those countries don't exist really, right? So to whom do you return this? It's also contested. But there's really an issue of conservancy that's a big one. And I'm thinking of different kind of heritage. When you think of the heritage, for example, of the Holocaust, right? So the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum was, until very recently, all of the conservancy effort was being paid by the Polish state that had very, very little resources and was doing its best, but what had significant failings with that. So, once the Abay Mai gate was stolen and sold on the market, well, then they raised funds, and then the German government intervened and said, okay, we're going to start cost sharing that. So this is happening in different kind of museological spaces where you have material heritage, either of historical events or of, ancient cultures. And that becomes like a world problem. And that's why the UNESCO, it's an interesting organization, since it doesn't have power to basically, do anything. It issues policies and best practices, but it has no power in enforcing anything. Or
That's right. in hopes that its member states will come to an agreement. I mean, I am sympathetic to the appeal to balance, as you put it. And I think when I hear that, it is in search of an ethic of justice and some approximation of like evenness or fairness in the redistribution of objects. So then attached to that come some other questions, whose justice is it, whose fairness? And if in the initial great global distribution, or we could say seizure and removal of objects, there was no ethic of restraint or moderation or fairness for the colonized people, then I think we need to ask again what whose interests should we be thinking about. There are also creative approaches or solutions now to recreating objects so that a museum can have an exact copy or replica, and maybe the original goes back. I think that there can be an attached set of discussions about what that might look like. But the core, the fundamental here is justice and fairness. And I think that's what we're all still kind of working on, in how you get at that, and in what settings or what mechanisms. I think what's been upsetting for some people in the last couple of years is the resort to direct action, to street protests, to boycotts, to disinvestment. For those who love museums and love to go to art and see cosmopolitan museums as really having a mission to educate or to bring people close to things. I think that is when it raises these really sensitive questions about how best to approach conversations.
I have one question. Okay, so maybe we can take two questions and you wrap up in your answer. But I have one online that I'm going to read. In terms of state power in world politics, it's interesting that UNESCO, as an indicator to measure cultural power, that China follows closely after Italy, while the US is way behind both of them. And you mentioned the hard power, soft power conceptualization by Ni. How this work tell us more about this conceptual duo? Does Italy as cultural power produce new ways of thinking through state power in world politics? And do you want to ask your second question and you can respond to both?
Okay, sure.
Like wrapping up?
Hi. Yes, so yeah, I think I wanted to, you mentioned briefly archaeological context, and I think I was hoping that you could say a bit more, because I think it's important to realize that in the process of extracting these objects from the source countries, the context is almost always irreparably destroyed. And so it's like ripping out an elimination from a manuscript and throwing away the burning the manuscript. And when you return the picture, that you don't return the manuscript is lost forever, the manuscript being the archaeological context. So, when the Met pays for those cultures, it's paying for the destruction of culture in Italy. It's funding people who will go and actively destroy cultural information that will never be retrieved again. So, and you just even touched on that very briefly, but I was hoping that you could say a bit more about that.
Affirmed, absolutely, right? And so also when the Met for years refuses to entertain the claim or accept the evidence of looting because they poke holes in it, it's not quite complete, when the burden of proof is on the Italians in that case, we are always already reproducing the institutional logic that prioritizes the museum and legitimates that pain for destruction, as you so eloquently put it. And so that's been a problem for years in international restitution. If the source country can't prove its find spot, if provenance is solely linked to archaeological context, but through the looting, that context was destroyed, then it can't advance its claims. Hence this building out of provenance in other ways. Yeah, I mean, I think this is absolutely critical, and also a reminder that even as I observed selective enforcement on the front line, there's always this tension in what these local tomb robbers are doing. Even if they're going into excavation sites that have been like thoroughly documented, each new level that they tear through is information lost, cannot be reconstructed, no matter how similar that site is to 100 other sites throughout the country. That's the loss. And as for the question that was online, I just think that what we're all going to be seeing in this wave of post-colonial restitution is setting this dichotomy on a new axis, bringing out different sources of power that haven't been formally inducted into international art restitution, that kind of didn't get that far, but new forms of involvement, positive direct action will be moving this yet again. I'm kind of rushing through because I know that we're nearly at time. There's obviously a lot more there, but thank you for the questions.
Thank you so much, Fiona, and thank you for everyone for coming here today. And I'd like to advertise 2 more events. We have another lecture on Wednesday by Janine Di Giovanni, who's a war reporter and director of the Reckoning Project. Ukraine Testifies, so it's a collective of reporters who are collecting testimonies from Ukrainians right now. And we have a team of University of Michigan students and faculty who are coding those testimonies, preparing them for The Hague. So she's giving a lecture on the project and her experience as a war reporter in Rwanda, Yugoslavia, Iraq, Syria, Wednesday at 5 p.m. And was there another event I needed to say? No, I think that's the one event. It's on the 10th floor, that one. On the 10th floor. So please come join us on Wednesday, 10th floor, and thank you again, Fiona.
Thank you.